The announcement came in the early hours of Tuesday morning from the White House briefing room, where President Donald Trump declared what he described as a public safety emergency in the nation's capital. His decision to deploy approximately 800 National Guard troops to Washington and to federalize the Metropolitan Police Department was framed as a necessary intervention against what he called a city overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals. The timing was deliberate, the symbolism calculated, and the constitutional mechanics complex. Under the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, a president can assume control of the D.C. police for an initial 48 hours without prior authorization, then extend that control to 30 days with notification to Congress, and beyond that, only with congressional approval. By invoking this authority, the administration has signaled both a readiness to employ federal power in a domestic security context and a willingness to test the boundaries of local autonomy in a jurisdiction that has never enjoyed the same sovereignty as a U.S. state. From a purely statistical perspective, the decision comes against a backdrop that appears, at first glance, inconsistent with the crisis narrative. Official crime data shows violent crime in Washington down 26% from the previous year, approaching a 30-year low after a post-pandemic spike. Yet the president has publicly dismissed these figures, challenging their validity and emphasizing the visibility of certain crimes, particularly incidents involving repeat offenders or foreign nationals present in the country, illegally. His language has been unambiguous, describing the Capitol as an embarrassment before visiting world leaders and vowing to conduct massive enforcement operations to remove targeted individuals from the streets, or, in his words, to remove them from the country altogether. The operational plan involves more than the deployment of guard units. Law enforcement personnel from over 18 federal agencies are expected to integrate with D.C. police under federal command, establishing what the president described as full, seamless, integrated cooperation across jurisdictions. National Guard units, although not in direct patrol roles, will provide visible presence and logistical support, reinforcing the psychological dimension of deterrence. The president has made clear that if required, he is prepared to escalate beyond the Guard to bring in active-duty military units. The intent is to project overwhelming force not merely to respond to crime, but to make a statement about authority and control in the federal district. This move has generated immediate political pushback. Mayor Muriel Bowser, not briefed in advance of the announcement, called the action unprecedented and unsettling, though she pledged to work with federal authorities to mitigate disruptions. She rejected the portrayal of Washington as comparable to a war zone and emphasized that the city's current challenges are far from the picture being drawn. Congressional Democrats, led by figures such as Representative Jamie Raskin, have begun discussing amendments to the Home Rule Act to limit the president's ability to militarize D.C. without local consent. In practical terms, such measures are unlikely to advance in the current Republican-controlled Congress, but the debate underscores a deeper constitutional question: the balance of power between the federal executive and the quasi-autonomous governance structure of the nation's capital. The legal mechanics are equally important. The D.C. National Guard has always been under federal, not local, control. Unlike state governors, the mayor has no authority to activate it. This structural fact, long a source of friction, means that the president's ability to use the Guard in the district is not contingent on local approval. The federalization of the police, however, is a more limited tool, one that requires political capital and justification to extend beyond the initial 30-day period. In that sense, this operation is both a tactical move to address immediate priorities and a strategic test case for expanding federal control over urban law enforcement in other contexts. Against this domestic backdrop, another major decision point is approaching on the international stage. In 3 days' time, President Trump is scheduled to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, a high-stakes summit aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. The framing is personal and transactional. The president has said that within the first 2 minutes of the meeting, he will know whether a deal can be made. His stated objective is to get rid of a war that somebody else started, a phrasing that shifts responsibility to prior leadership while asserting his role as dealmaker. The most controversial element of his approach is the suggestion of a land swap, a negotiated redrawing of lines that would see Ukraine cede some territory to Russia in exchange for peace. This notion has drawn alarm from U.S. allies in Europe and from Kyiv itself. Their concern is not only moral, that rewarding aggression undermines the principle of sovereignty, but strategic, in that it could embolden future territorial claims by other powers. The president has argued that the front lines are uneven, that some form of territorial adjustment is inevitable, and that his goal is to regain some of that territory for Ukraine while securing an end to hostilities. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has rejected the concept outright, insisting that any concession of territory would require a constitutional amendment, a process he is unwilling to initiate under conditions of foreign occupation. He maintains that a ceasefire must precede any negotiations, a position at odds with the sequencing preferred by the U.S. president. Intelligence from Kyiv claims that Russia is preparing for a new offensive, suggesting that Moscow's calculus may not yet favor compromise. European Union leaders, excluded from the Alaska talks, have issued statements reaffirming Ukraine's right to determine its own future, warning that the path to peace cannot be decided without Ukraine. For Washington, the optics of engaging directly with Moscow while sidelining Kyiv and its European backers are complex. On one hand, this creates space for bold negotiation free from multilateral constraints. On the other, it risks alienating partners and undermining collective deterrence frameworks built since the invasion began. In purely strategic terms, this is a calculated gamble. If a deal emerges, the administration can claim a singular diplomatic victory. If it fails, the president will own the consequences of bypassing traditional allies. The capacity to project power abroad is always linked to stability at home, and recent events within the United States highlight vulnerabilities beyond the political sphere. In Austin, Texas, a gunman killed 3 people, including a child, in the parking lot of a retail store. The suspect, a 32-year-old male with a history of mental health issues and prior criminal activity, fled the scene in a stolen vehicle, later hijacking another before being apprehended. While this may appear as an isolated act of violence, its resonance is broader, illustrating the persistent challenge of internal security in a society where firearms are widely available and enforcement systems face both legal and logistical constraints. In Pennsylvania, an explosion at a steel plant outside Pittsburgh killed 2 workers and injured at least 10 more, 5 critically. This facility, a century-old anchor of the local economy, produces coke, a critical input for steelmaking. The incident triggered temporary shelter-in-place orders for nearby residents, though air quality readings did not indicate hazardous contamination beyond federal thresholds. From a strategic industrial perspective, such incidents underscore the fragility of critical manufacturing infrastructure. Even absent malicious intent, industrial accidents can disrupt supply chains, damage economic resilience, and in certain scenarios, create vulnerabilities that adversaries could exploit in times of heightened tension. These domestic crises, while distinct in cause, converge in their implications. They demonstrate the dual demands on federal leadership, maintaining internal order and industrial capacity, while simultaneously engaging in high-stakes diplomacy abroad. For a presidency pursuing an assertive agenda from deploying National Guard units in the capital to negotiating territorial settlements between foreign adversaries, each domestic incident is both a potential distraction and a test of the narrative that strong leadership can impose order in all domains. Environmental conditions add another layer to this complex strategic landscape. A heat wave is stretching across large swathes of the United States, from the desert Southwest to the Pacific Northwest, and across the Great Lakes into New England. Temperatures in Seattle are exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, Las Vegas and Tucson are in triple digits, and the eastern seaboard is also experiencing above-average heat. High surface ozone levels in cities like Boston, Hartford, and New York combine with residual wildfire smoke from Canada to create sustained air quality concerns. In operational terms, extreme weather event stress, public health systems, energy grids, and emergency response capacity, all of which intersect with national security when resources are finite and demand spikes occur simultaneously in multiple regions. In the Atlantic, Tropical Storm Erin, projected to strengthen to a Category 3 hurricane by late week, is tracking westward, with potential implications for the Caribbean and possibly the U.S. East Coast. While no direct impacts are forecast at this stage, the storm is a reminder of the cyclical nature of environmental threats and the necessity of contingency planning. The capacity to monitor, forecast, and respond to such hazards is itself a measure of national preparedness. A preparedness that, if stretched thin by concurrent domestic security operations and foreign policy engagements, could degrade. Even the cultural domain, often dismissed as peripheral to geopolitics, plays a role in shaping perceptions of national vitality. The announcement of a new album by a global cultural figure such as Taylor Swift may seem unrelated to questions of security and strategy, yet in the realm of soft power, cultural exports remain a significant vector of influence. The global entertainment industry, particularly when driven by U.S. creators with massive international audiences, contributes to the projection of American identity abroad. In periods of geopolitical uncertainty, cultural output can reinforce narratives of creativity, resilience, and leadership, or conversely, reflect internal preoccupations that distract from strategic focus. When viewed as a whole, the events of this week illustrate the breadth of arenas in which national leadership must operate. Domestically, the federalization of law enforcement in the capital raises enduring constitutional questions about the distribution of power. Internationally, the Alaska summit with Russia tests the limits of bilateral diplomacy in the absence of allied consensus. Incidents of violence and industrial accidents expose systemic vulnerabilities, while environmental extremes and approaching hurricanes forecast additional demands on national capacity. Cultural developments, though seemingly distant from the calculus of statecraft, remain part of the ecosystem in which national image is formed and sustained. In strategic terms, the through line is one of convergence. Multiple vectors of risk, security, diplomacy, infrastructure, environment, and culture are intersecting within the same operational timeframe. The president's challenge is to manage each without allowing one to compromise the others, to ensure that domestic security operations in Washington do not undermine the credibility of peace negotiations in Alaska, that industrial recovery in Pennsylvania proceeds without siphoning resources from emergency readiness for extreme weather, and that even as high-profile cultural events dominate headlines, the machinery of state remains aligned to core strategic objectives. The essence of cold logic is to strip away sentiment and examine capability, intent, and consequence. The capability of the federal government to act unilaterally in the capital is clear. The intent, in both domestic and foreign theaters, is to demonstrate decisive authority and produce tangible outcomes within constrained timelines. The consequence will depend on execution, perception, and the interplay between these domestic and international moves in the weeks ahead. As the National Guard takes position on the streets of Washington, as negotiators prepare briefing books for Alaska, and as the nation monitors storms, heat waves, and shifting lines on the geopolitical map, the question is not whether these events are connected, but how, in the aggregate, they will define the trajectory of U.S. power in the closing months of 2025.